The text message arrived while a nurse was prepping my left arm for the IV line. My husband's name lit up my cracked phone screen, and for one stupid hopeful second, I thought he was calling to say he was already on his way. Instead, it read, "Can't step out right now. The Q4 presentation is in 10 minutes and I'm presenting. You'll be fine. You always are. Call your sister." I typed back with one thumb while the nurse taped down the catheter. Okay, that single word would end our 9-year marriage, though my husband didn't know it yet. He was too busy rehearsing slides with Rebecca to notice his wife was about to go into emergency surgery. The pain had started Tuesday morning, a dull pressure low on my right side that I'd chalked up to bad takeout from the night before. I taught grade 11 English at Runnymede Collegiate, and Tuesday was my most demanding day back-to-back classes with barely 15 minutes between periods. I swallowed 2 ibuprofen, drank a full thermos of tea from the staff room, and got through it. By Tuesday afternoon, the dull pressure had become something sharper, more insistent. By the time I pulled into our driveway in Leslieville at 5:30, I was moving carefully, the way you move when something inside you is telling you to be gentle with yourself. My husband's car wasn't there. He texted at 4 to say the team was staying late to finalize the year-end gala presentation. The firm held their annual Client Appreciation Gala every December at the Fairmont Royal York downtown, and this year my husband was leading the presentation for the first time in his career at the firm. He'd been talking about it for 3 months. Rebecca had designed the slides. Rebecca had co-written the talking points. Rebecca had apparently become indispensable to his professional existence sometime around February, though I hadn't been informed until much later. I made myself soup I couldn't eat and went to bed early, telling myself I'd feel better in the morning. I didn't. By 2 in the morning, I was doubled over in our bathroom, and the pain had moved from discomfort into something that made me grip the counter and breathe through my teeth. I knew what appendicitis felt like from a chapter in a first aid manual I'd taught years ago during a health literacy unit. The location, the progression, the specific quality of the pain. I knew. I still texted my husband first. "I think something might be wrong. Pain is pretty bad on my right side." 3 dots appeared. Disappeared. Appeared again. Growing pains lull. Take Advil and try to sleep. Big day tomorrow. I stared at that message for a moment. Then I called 911 myself. The paramedics arrived within 8 minutes, 2 of them, calm and efficient in the particular way emergency responders are calm, which is not actually calm at all but rather a controlled urgency that gets things done without adding panic to the situation. The younger one, barely 25, asked me standard intake questions while his partner assessed my abdomen. When she pressed on the lower right quadrant and then released suddenly, my sharp intake of breath told them everything they needed to know. "We're going to get you to St. Michael's," she said. "You're doing great." In the ambulance, I called my husband. It rang 4 times and went to voicemail. I called again. Voicemail. I left a message that I was in an ambulance on my way to St. Michael's Hospital and that I needed him to come. My voice was steady. I was proud of that. The steadiness came not from strength exactly but from a kind of controlled shock, the same mechanism that had me texting "okay" later instead of anything more honest. At St. Michael's, the emergency physician confirmed what I already suspected. My appendix was inflamed and the window for intervention without rupture was narrowing. They needed to operate, ideally within the next few hours. A nurse named Denise, who had the particular warmth of someone who has held a great many hands in frightening moments, sat with me while I signed consent forms. "Is there someone we can call for you?" she asked. "A family member or emergency contact." "My husband," I said automatically, and gave her his number. She tried twice. Both times, his phone went straight to voicemail. He had turned it off for the presentation. I lay in the pre-op bay staring at the acoustic tiles overhead, running calculations in my head the way I do when I'm trying not to feel something I'm not ready to feel yet. My husband knew I was in pain. He'd received my text. He knew something was wrong. And he had turned his phone off anyway because the presentation was in 10 minutes and Rebecca's slides needed to be shown to the right people in the right room. That's when I called my sister. She answered on the second ring, her voice still thick with sleep, and I heard the sheets rustle as she sat up. "Hamilton to Toronto," I said. "How fast can you get here?" "Tell me which hospital," she said. And I could already hear her getting up. I gave her the information. Then I lay back and thought about 9 years. 9 years of making his lunch when his schedule was brutal. 9 years of attending his firm's summer barbecues and laughing at his colleagues' jokes and making conversation with their wives about things I had no interest in. 9 years of the particular invisible labor of maintaining a household while also working full-time. Because my husband had a demanding career and my career as a teacher was apparently flexible, which is something people who have never taught grade 11 English to 30 teenagers at once believe without having examined the assumption. Rebecca had appeared in my husband's stories last February. He'd mentioned her the way you mention a new coffee maker briefly, functionally, as a tool that had improved his workflow. She was sharp, he said. She had a way of seeing problems from unexpected angles. The project they were co-leading was going well. By April, Rebecca was appearing in the stories more often. By June, the stories had become anecdotes, fuller and more detailed, the kind of telling that suggests the teller has been thinking about these moments between retellings. By August, I'd met her at the firm's summer event, a tall woman with direct eye contact and an easy laugh who touched my husband's arm when she wanted to emphasize a point. He straightened when she laughed. I recognized the posture. I used to cause it. I'd brought it up carefully one evening in September, over dinner I'd made after a full day of teaching and a meeting that had run 45 minutes long. I'd chosen my words deliberately, keeping my tone neutral and factual, the way I try to model for my students when they're writing argumentative essays. I feel like your relationship with Rebecca has become something I don't fully understand, I'd said. The amount of time, the texts late at night, the way you talk about her. Can we talk about it? My husband had put his fork down with a patience that felt slightly rehearsed. She was a colleague. They were under enormous pressure with this client file. Emotional intelligence was a professional skill, and being a supportive coworker wasn't a character flaw. He had seemed genuinely puzzled by my concern, or genuinely good at seeming so. I couldn't tell which anymore and wasn't sure it mattered. You've always been a bit prone to reading into things, he said, and picked his fork back up. The surgery took 47 minutes. When I came around in the recovery room, the first face I saw was my sister's. She'd driven from Hamilton in just under an hour, which told me she had not driven the speed limit. Her coat was still half-sipped, her hair pulled back quickly, and she was holding a paper cup of Tim Hortons coffee that had clearly gone cold while she waited. Hey, she said. Hey, I said. My mouth tasted like anesthesia and the particular staleness of institutional air. The doctor said it went perfectly. Caught it in time. She squeezed my hand. No one else is here. I knew what she meant. I know, I said. My phone had been with my belongings in a bag beside the bed. Denise brought it over when I asked, and I found 3 texts from my husband sent between 11:30 and midnight, each one a variation on a theme I was starting to recognize. Just saw your voicemail. Why didn't you call more than once? I had my phone off for 20 minutes. I'm sure the doctors are handling it. Text me when you're out. Why would you contact the hospital without telling me? I could have been there. I read them in order twice. The hospital hadn't contacted him because he'd turned his phone off and they'd tried twice before giving up. I had left a voicemail. The math of his complaint didn't add up, and I was running on anesthesia and approximately 4 hours of sleep, but I could still do the math. My sister was reading over my shoulder. She didn't say anything, but I felt her stillness change quality. Don't, I said. I'm not saying anything. You're thinking very loudly. She reached over and took my phone gently, then set it face down on the blanket. Rest. We'll deal with everything else later. I slept for 3 hours, and when I woke up there was a new message on my phone. Not from my husband. From Rebecca. I stared at her name for a moment before opening it. Hi. I know this is strange and I'm sorry for intruding. I got your number from Daniel's emergency contact form because I didn't know how else to reach you. I wanted you to know I had no idea you were in hospital tonight. When the gala ended and people were getting their coats, someone mentioned Daniel's wife had emergency surgery, and I watched his face to see how he'd react. He said, and I'm sorry, I really am. He said you'd probably exaggerated to get him to leave the presentation. He said you do that when you feel neglected. I don't know what your marriage is like. I'm not in a position to judge. But I've been sitting in my Uber for 20 minutes and I can't just say nothing. I hope you're okay. I read it 3 times. My sister had stepped out to get us both something from the vending machine down the hall. When she came back and found me sitting up with the phone in both hands and an expression she'd only seen on my face once before, at our mother's funeral, she sat down without speaking and waited. I handed her the phone. She read it. Her jaw tightened incrementally with each sentence in the way that our father's jaw tightened when he was working very hard not to say something he would regret. When she finished, she handed the phone back. "Okay," she said. "Tell me what you need." That was the moment something settled inside my chest. Not broke settled. The way a structure settles when you've finally identified the crack that's been there all along. 9 years of making myself smaller and quieter and more accommodating. 9 years of chalking up my discomfort to my tendency to read into things. 9 years of being the practical one. The reliable one. The one who handled logistics while he handled ambitions. And he had stood at the Fairmont Royal York in his good suit in front of his colleagues and told them his wife was probably exaggerating. "I need a lawyer," I said. "And I need someone to change the locks." My sister smiled. Not happily. The way you smile when something you've been quietly bracing for has finally arrived. "I have a friend who does family law. And my neighbor back home does locksmithing. He owes me a favor from the Reno." "How soon?" "I'll make some calls in the morning." My husband arrived at the hospital at 7:15 the next morning, 20 minutes before I was discharged. He came in looking slightly disheveled, carrying a coffee from the second cup in the lobby. And his first words were not "How are you?" or "I'm sorry," or even just my name. His first words were, "The hospital was supposed to call me more than once." I looked at him across the recovery room. Denise was nearby, doing paperwork, and I was aware of her awareness of the conversation. "They called twice," I said. "You turned your phone off." "For 20 minutes. For long enough." He sat down and ran a hand through his hair. The coffee sat on the side table untouched. I noticed he hadn't asked how the surgery had gone or whether there were complications. He was still working on establishing why what had happened wasn't his fault, which I recognized as a stage he tended to occupy for quite a while before moving on. "You sent your sister," he said, as if this was a tactical choice I'd made against him. "I called you 4 times. I was presenting." "I know," I said. "I know exactly where you were." He looked at me, then really looked, and I think something in my face told him that the geometry of this conversation was different from all the others we'd had. That I wasn't building toward a tearful confrontation or waiting to be reassured. I was simply done. My sister drove me home. We didn't talk much. She put on the radio, something low and unremarkable, and I watched the city move past the window, gray and cold in a way December in Toronto always is, and thought about all the unremarkable mornings I'd spent in the passenger seat of my life letting someone else choose the route. At home, she made toast and scrambled eggs and brought them to me on the couch without being asked. I ate them even though I wasn't particularly hungry, because she'd driven from Hamilton and she was worried, and eating was a way of telling her I was going to be okay. My sister's lawyer friend called at 9. I answered and was immediately struck by how efficiently a life can be dismantled when you have the right information and the right people. She asked me a series of precise questions about the ownership structure of our home, our financial accounts, what was in my name versus jointly held. We'd bought our semi-detached in Leslieville 6 years ago, both names on the title. Mortgaged but significantly appreciated, which is the only thing that reliably appreciates in Toronto. "Given the circumstances," she said, "you may want to begin with a formal separation agreement and work from there. I'd recommend documenting everything before he has a chance to move assets." She used words like equalization and matrimonial home and deferred compensation with the calm efficiency of someone who has had this conversation many times and understands that the people on the other end of it are trying very hard to hold themselves together. I took notes on a notepad my sister found in the kitchen drawer. The locksmith arrived at 11, a quiet man named Gary who made no eye contact and asked no questions and replaced the deadbolt on the front door and the lock on the back gate in 40 minutes flat. He handed me 2 new keys and said, "If he tries to force it, that's a police matter." Then he left. My husband came home at noon to find the key he'd used that morning no longer worked. I watched through the front window as he tried the lock twice, then stood on the porch for a moment, then pulled out his phone. My sister answered the door. Because I'd asked her to. "Daniel," she said, pleasantly, in the tone of someone who has been waiting 9 years to say the next sentence. "Hannah's resting. She had emergency surgery last night, in case that's helpful context. Her lawyer has been in touch with her this morning about next steps, and she'll be in contact through them going forward. Your belongings will be boxed and available for collection this weekend. Please confirm a time so someone can be present." My husband said something I couldn't hear. My sister nodded once, said, "I'll pass that along," and closed the door. She came back to the living room and sat down. "He looks terrible," she said, without sympathy. "Good," I said, and was mildly surprised to find I meant it. The boxing took 2 days. My sister and 2 of her friends, women I'd known for over a decade, came Saturday morning with flattened boxes from the liquor store on Queen Street and spent 4 hours moving through our home with the focused energy of people who are doing something they believe in. I couldn't do much physically given the surgical site, so I sat at the kitchen table directing traffic and making lists, which is its own kind of useful. His things were not as numerous as 9 years might suggest, because a great deal of what was in our home had been purchased by me or chosen by me or maintained by me, which is the invisible accounting of domestic partnership that only becomes visible when the partnership ends. His actual belongings, his clothes, his sporting equipment, the coffee grinder he'd insisted on and used twice, his collection of business books arranged on the shelf by height for appearance rather than interest, his golf clubs he brought out every summer for 2 rounds and then stored in the garage, 14 boxes. Realistic, manageable, a number that fit in a van. His brother came Sunday afternoon with a rental minivan from the budget on Danforth. He was polite in the strained way of someone caught between family loyalty and personal discomfort. He and my husband loaded the boxes in 2 trips. On the last trip, my husband stood in the entryway for a moment, looking at the walls where his framed firm achievements had hung, now showing lighter rectangles of paint. He seemed to be waiting for me to say something. I didn't. His brother touched his shoulder gently. "Let's go, man." They left. I heard the van pull away. The house was quiet in a way it hadn't been in years, a stillness that wasn't absence but space. The news from the firm came through indirectly, the way news in a city like Toronto tends to travel, through a mutual connection who worked at a different firm on Bay Street and had heard it from someone who'd been at the gala. It seemed that the managing partner, a woman named Dr. Okafor, who had built the firm over 22 years and had opinions about what professional conduct looked like, had been standing nearby when someone told my husband about the surgery mid-gala. She had watched his face. She had heard his response. And she had said nothing that evening. But when the Q4 review happened 2 weeks later, the senior associate promotion my husband had been anticipating for 18 months went to someone else. The reasons given were professional and non-specific. No one said anything about character or priorities or the particular way a man behaves when he thinks no one important is watching. They didn't need to. I heard about it from my sister, who heard it from her lawyer friend, who had a colleague at the firm. The network of women who tell each other things is more efficient than any org chart. Rebecca had distanced herself from my husband immediately after the gala. From what I gathered secondhand, she'd seemed genuinely disturbed by what she'd witnessed and what she'd written to me. She moved her desk. She removed herself from their shared client file. My husband had apparently not anticipated this particular consequence. The one where the person you chose over your wife observes who you actually are and makes her own calculation. He texted me 3 times in the 2 weeks after he collected his boxes. Each message was longer than the one before, and each one followed the same structural logic. Acknowledgement of the surface fact that things had gone wrong, followed by a reframe in which his behavior was the product of pressure and circumstance rather than character, followed by an appeal to 9 years and what they had meant and what it would be to throw them away. He used the phrase "I've never been good at managing stress" in the second message, which I found interesting, since the presentation he'd been too stressed to leave had apparently gone very well. I read all 3 messages. I didn't respond. My lawyer handled all necessary communication. 3 months after the surgery, I was cleared to return to full teaching. January back in a grade 11 classroom after any kind of disruption is its own particular challenge. 30 teenagers who have survived their own winter holidays with varying degrees of difficulty and need something from you that they can't quite name. I found I had more patience for it than usual. Something had shifted in my capacity for presence when the performance of presence had been removed from my life. My sister came up from Hamilton for the weekend in late January, and we went to the AGO on Saturday afternoon and then to a restaurant on King Street that I'd been wanting to try for a year but somehow hadn't managed to, because there was always something else to organize, and the inertia of a life built around someone else's preferences is harder to shift than you realize until it's gone. We ordered things we wanted rather than things we thought we should want, and we sat at the table for 2 hours talking about absolutely nothing important, and I laughed 3 times loud enough that the people at the next table glanced over, and none of it required managing anyone else's comfort. "You look different," my sister said. Over dessert she'd ordered without asking if I thought it was a good idea. Different how? Like yourself. I thought about that. About what it means to look like yourself. And whether there's a version of yourself that gets slowly papered over by accommodation until the original is barely visible, and whether you can find it again or whether you're building something new on the same foundation. I wasn't sure it mattered which. Either way, the work was worth doing. The equalization process took 5 months. Our house had appreciated considerably since we'd bought it, which made the math uncomfortable for my husband and clarifying for me. My lawyer friend, whose calm competence I had come to rely on the way I used to rely on my own, guided me through each step with a clarity that I tried to match. It was not painless. None of it was painless. But there is a specific and honest kind of pain in doing something necessary, and it bears no resemblance to the chronic dull ache of staying somewhere you've already left. The first Thursday in June, 9 months after the surgery and 8 months after my husband's key stopped working, I was sitting on my back deck in Leslieville in the early evening with a glass of wine I'd bought because the label had a heron on it and I liked herons. The cherry tree in the corner of the yard that I'd planted 3 years ago and my husband had called impractical because it would drop fruit on the patio was in full ridiculous bloom, petals drifting into the yard with the particular extravagance of a thing that blooms hard for 2 weeks and doesn't apologize for the mess it makes. My phone was on the table face up. No anxiety about what might be on it. No waiting for a message that might or might not arrive. My sister had texted an hour ago to say she'd seen my husband at a gas station off the 403 and he'd looked, in her words, like a man rethinking several life choices. I'd sent back a heron emoji and left it at that. A colleague from work, a history teacher named Priya who had been a quiet and consistent presence through the last year, had texted asking if I wanted to come to a trivia night at a bar on Dundas the following Wednesday. I'd said yes before I finished reading the question, which felt like progress. The cherry tree dropped 3 petals onto my wine glass. I fished them out with one finger, unhurried. 9 years. 9 years had felt, in the middle of them, like a structure solid enough to last a lifetime. In the accounting of it, the actual inventory, what I had was 14 boxes of things that didn't belong to me anymore, a surgical scar below my right hip that was already fading to something faint and silver, a semi-detached house in Leslieville that I was learning to fill with things I actually wanted, and a Thursday evening in June that belonged entirely to no one but me. The heron on the wine label looked extremely confident about its choices. I thought I understood the feeling. If Hannah's story hit close to home, this one will too. Hit the like button if you've ever been the person who texted okay when what you meant was something entirely different. And tell me in the comments what was the moment you knew. The single detail that made everything finally make sense. I read every single one. Subscribe. And turn on notifications so you don't miss what's coming next. The Twisted Bonds uploads every week, and trust me the stories only get better from here.